Let's look at an example of how to determine the real world equation if the graph is a curve. So notice on this graph, the line is not straightening out. It's definitely a downward curve. What this means is that we're not going to calculate the slope because curves don't have a slope. We are not going to use the equation of a line as our parent function because this is not a line. So instead, what we need to do is pick the appropriate parent function. Looking at this shape, I know that it is a hyperbola, and all hyperbolas follow the same parent function, y equals k divided by x. It's important for you to memorize the 4 shapes and the 4 equations and know which ones go together so that you can be successful when we analyze these. If this were a straight line, we would pick 2 cross points and calculate the slope. However, it's not a straight line, so we do something a little bit different. We only need to find 1 cross point, okay? So I'm going to write that down. 1 cross point. This is always true if you're looking at a curve. On this graph, it looks like we crossed right through this corner here. So notice my cross point is 10, 2. It's important for me to look at the scale. And this cross point is going to help us crack the code and solve for k. We do this by plugging the cross point into our formula. Make sure that you put x where x belongs and y where y belongs. So I end up with 2 equals k over 10. This is an algebra equation. I can solve this. What I need to do is get k all alone. They divided by 10. So what I'm going to do is multiply by 10. And I have to do it on both sides. So 2 times 10 is 20. These 10s cancel out, and I'm left with 20 equals k. Hurrah! This was the hard part, solving for k. The last thing we need to do is convert the parent equation into an equation that actually matches the graph. This just means we need to replace all of the original letters. So I ask myself, what was on the y-axis? On this graph, it's labeled velocity. So I'm going to use the letter v. What was my constant? We just decided that it was 20. So I'm going to put the number 20. What was on the x-axis? If I look at my graph, it was time. So I am going to use the letter t. What you are looking at is the final answer. Notice it looks like the parent function, but I've replaced each letter with something more appropriate that matches my graph. So, to review, if you have a curve, you only need to find 1 cross point, plug it into the parent equation, and solve for k. In some ways, this is actually less work than when you're dealing with a line. The hard part is making sure you do your algebra right when you solve for k. So let's look at a couple other shapes just to make sure you're doing the algebra right. Let's say that you had a parabola with this parent function, And your cross point is, let's see here, 5, 100. I'm just making up these. You would get this by looking at the graph. Well, we're going to plug in the x for x and the y for y. So I would do 100 equals k times 5 squared. Don't forget the square. That matters. If you have a calculator, you just need to figure out what is 5 squared. Well, 5 times 5 is 25, so this would be 100 equals k times 25. And then you would solve. Divide by 25 on both sides. 100 divided by 25 is 4. These cancel out, and we just solved for the constant. Notice that even though the equation had a square, I didn't have to use a square root to solve. So be careful with that. Some of you have bad habits from algebra. The minute you see a square, you try taking a root, and that's not always necessary. Let's look at the last example. What if you have a root graph with this parent equation, and when you look at the graph, you see that there is this cross point. Let's see here, 9, 2. So once again, we're going to plug in x for x and y for y. I have 2 equals k square root of 9. At this point, I just need to plug this into my calculator. What is the square root of 9? This happens to be an easy one. The square root of 9 is 3. There are times when you'll have an ugly square root, and so your calculator will give you a decimal. That's fine. To finish this, I just need to solve for k, so I'm going to divide both sides by 3. 2/3, if I put that in my calculator, is 0.67. And the 3's cancel out, so I just solved for my constant. Basically, we've looked at all 3 curve possibilities, so you should be able to handle any curve that you see.